Let's continue building our testimonial section by now adding the gallery. So here we already have the element with the class of gallery. And so this is where now we are going to add our 12 images. And so also the gallery will then of course be our grid container, right? Now here I could of course now simply put all these 12 images one after another. But I actually will want to build a very nice hover effect on these images. And so for that, I will need each of them to be inside of a container element. And for that, I will use again the figure with the class of gallery item. So not gallery, but more like this. And now let's add the image here. So img, and then reach into the gallery folder, and then here gallery 1. And the alt text is, and here I'm actually just going to write a generic alt text instead of describing each of the images perfectly. So I will just write photo of beautifully arranged food, because this is what all these images here are all about. Here, forgetting to close the element. Yeah, that's it. So the figure element is really the perfect container element for images. So many times when you see, for example, in a blog post images, then usually they also have some kind of caption. And for that, we can use the fig caption element and then write something basically below it. Something like this. All right. Now in this case, we actually don't want any caption. We simply want to display the image inside of this container. And again, the reason for that is a really cool hover effect, as I'm going to show you in a minute. So I will turn this off here, just so you know that we can also use the fig caption element inside of the figure element. So we cannot use this one outside. It is only allowed to be used inside of figure. Okay. But anyway, let's copy that here. Let's remove this, and now just gallery 2. And you see here, it is now a different image. And yeah, so just an image inside of a figure. And so now let's just copy this a couple of times. So not even counting here. If it's too much, we just delete the remaining ones. So 3, 4, 6. So we're halfway through because it's 12 images. 8, 9, 10, and we're just missing 1. Pasting that here again, and number 12. And there we go. So that's the HTML of our gallery. Very simple. But here, of course, it is going to look crazy. And it does. So, of course, we need to make them a lot smaller. And notice these small space here between the images. That is actually because the images are inline elements by default. And so if we made them a block element, then this would disappear. And this is something important that you need to know, because sometimes we get these annoying white spaces around images, and then this is how you fix that. So gallery item, and then I didn't add a class here to these images, so I'm simply using the descendant selector here. And so to fix that space, all we have to do is to set them to a block level element. And so now you see that the spacing is gone. Okay. But now, of course, what we will want to do is to actually create our grid. So that's right here on the gallery element. So gallery, and once again, here we are creating like our own new grid instead of using the predefined one. So display grid and then grid template columns. And we want 3 equal sized columns. So 3 times 1 FR. All right, but still that will not fix the problem because now the images are still huge and they no longer even fit our page. All right, and so of course the solution here is to make these images here flexible. So simply giving them a width of 100%. And so that should fix it, and it did. Nice. That's starting to look like something already. Let's just add some small spacing between the images, so not to have them glued together like that. And a very small gap here should be enough, like just 16 pixels. Something like this. And then let's go back. And that looks beautiful. Okay, so the gallery itself is actually already done, right? And so let's think now about this entire section, because there is still a lot of stuff that we need to fix here. So first of all, to make this section here stand out a little bit more, especially because we have these two content blocks here side by side, we should now give this section here a different background color. So you see that we have these 3 sections which all have the white background color. And the first one here, so the hero, has this very light orange tone. And so I think we should now finally go back to having a section with that orange tone as well to make it stand out a little bit more from the rest and to create some nice visual contrast here between the sections. So let's do that. And I think it is this one here. Right. So that looks already a lot nicer, I think, at least. But now there's still something strange going on, because it would be a lot nicer if the spacing, for example, here at the top would be exactly the same as is here between these images. And also here at the right side. So the gallery is glued right now here to the side of the browser. And it would be nice to basically also have the exact same spacing that is here inside of the gallery around it. So that would make it look a bit more natural. And so what we need to do is to basically remove this huge padding from the section and instead put it inside of this container right here. So having this big padding only inside of this left side. Okay. So I'm going to remove that from here and put it in the testimonials. And actually we will want it basically around the entire thing. So not just top and bottom, because with this, we will then finally also create some space around it. And actually that was the wrong element. So let's go back. Ah, yeah. So it should, of course, be here in the testimonials container. So not just around the grid container, but really inside this entire thing. So including the headings. Right? And yeah, so that is what I was going for. So with this, we have the exact same spacing here as we had in the other sections. And also below it. And also we have the same spacing here on the left side. So that looks perfect like this. But now let's think about the spacing that I was talking about earlier. So basically adding this spacing around the gallery that is also inside of it. So that shouldn't be too hard. We can simply add some padding also inside the gallery. So padding 1.6 rem, And so again, the exact same spacing as we have here, right? And that is exactly what I was talking about. So that looks really cool, I think. And it's nicely integrated now, basically into this section. Now we just have some problems here, I would say. For example, that here the text is quite narrow and it is breaking here into these 5 lines in this one and in this one, while here at the top we only have 4 lines. So all in all, it is looking a bit narrow, and I think even the spacing between these two is not enough. So the spacing here, I think, between the rows is good, but it's many times the case that for the columns we need some more spacing. So let's actually increase that before we do the other thing that I was talking about. So the row gap is good already. But now let's add a lot more column gap. So many times it doesn't look so natural to have the same gap in the row and in the column. And so the column many times needs a lot more. So that looks a lot better in terms of spacing, but then we made the problem even worse of the content here being too narrow. So there are 2 things that we need to fix here. First of all, there is too much space between the gallery and the testimonials here. And let me show you that in the inspector. So the inspector, once again, is really an invaluable tool here. So what I mean here is that, of course, around the testimonials container, we have our padding of 9.6, right? And so that's basically the space that we would want between these testimonials and the gallery. However, here inside this grid, we also have this spacing, right? And so this space we actually do not want here. So instead of using this predefined grid here, so our big layout grid, we will actually once again create our own grid. So for this reason that we can remove then the gap here, but there's also a second reason which I will talk about next. So that is the second thing that I mentioned earlier. So I said the first thing is that the spacing here is too much, which is because we're adding the padding plus the column gap. But then the second problem is that I think that actually this gallery here is a bit too wide. So right now, of course, these columns have the same size, but we should fix that. Okay, but first, let's do that first thing. So removing this predefined grid from here and creating our own grid for the section testimonials. So that's here. And so display grid. And then grid template columns. And for now, I will again make them equally sized, just so we can see that first problem being fixed. Okay. And so now you see that the only spacing that we have here is basically coming from this padding, and then also that 1.6 rem of padding that is coming here from the gallery. But I would say that we can neglect that one, right? So this is a bit better now, but still we have these two here in 5 lines of text and not just 4, which would make them look a lot better like here. Also, this content here is very dense. It's like a big wall of a lot of colorful and big content. And so if you take a look at this, it kind of looks as though this right side here would be a lot bigger than the left side, right? It has a huge visual impact. And so I think we can fix that a little bit simply by making this gallery a little bit more narrow. And so that will then, of course, free up some space here for this left side, and will also visually make it look a lot more balanced. Okay. Now, here, of course, we don't want to make huge changes. So, for example, we don't want this column to be twice as wide as the other one. That would be way too much, right? So, like this, it also doesn't look good. So one trick that I like to use when I'm using FRs here is to use them as though they were percentages. So remember that these two values here, they actually don't need to be 1 in order for the columns to have the same size. They simply need to be the same number. So we could also say 50 and 50, right? So that would then look exactly the same as before. And so now this looks a little bit like percentages, where this one is like 50% and this one is another 50%. Just remember that we do not use percentages here because then we wouldn't take care of the gap. Now here we don't have a gap, but anyway, we always should use FR. Now the point of this is that now we can say that this one should be like 55% and this one just 45. And so with this, we still have 100. And so the width is the same as before, but it is now going to be a bit more balanced. So you see that? So this is, I think, a lot better. And again, of course, these two together do not need to be 100. We just do it like this so we can think of this in terms of percentages. So that's just a nice trick that I like to use myself. Okay. Now, if we check this out, this will create a problem. Well, actually not right now, but let's see that we make this a bit smaller. Then we would get all this weird spacing here between these rows, right? And we do not want that, of course. And so here in our grid, let's define align items set to center. And so that will, or at least it should, fix that problem. Right. Now, of course, the spacing here is gone, like that uniform spacing that we had with this 1.6 rem at the top as well. And so this is not ideal, but we will fix this a little bit later with media queries. Okay, for now, on this screen size here at least, I think it looks really, really nice. Now, just a small detail that I mentioned before is the color of this text here. So remember that it is 777 on now this background color. And so the contrast ratio might not be great at this point. So let's actually check that here in the contrast checker. And so, yeah, well, we're actually using this one, but still it is poor. So it should be above 4.5. And so what I'm going to do now is to basically drag this here as low as it can before it becomes yellow, basically, right? So yellow means that it is at least 4.5, which means it is acceptable. So this gray color here is basically the last one that we can use safely on this background color. So let me copy it and use this one instead. Okay. So VS Code then converted it to the lowercase f's. And let me actually paste then this color here in our design decisions. And I'm going to say lightest gray allowed on this one. All right. So let's go back. And yeah, nice. So it looks almost the same as before, but it is still significantly lighter than this one, creating this nice visual hierarchy between this more important content and then this one. All right, and with this, we are almost finished with this section. So we could actually say we are finished, but remember how I said that I wanted to show you a nice hover effect here on these images. And so let me now show you what I'm talking about. So basically what I want to do is that whenever we hover over one of these images, that they'll scale up so that they become a little bit larger. So that's quite simple. So we will again select these images, and then we will define the hover state on the images. So basically what happens as we hover over the images. So here again we use the transform property, which remember has all kinds of different options. So we have used all the time the translates functions here, but there are other things that we can do. For example, we could rotate them. So let's try that, like 45 degrees. So DEG stands for degrees, and so that's yet another unit that we can use in CSS. So of course this is not what we're going for, but we could do this. So now the images rotate. And sometimes if you're building something like a more creative layout, then this might actually be a nice effect to go for. But in this case, what I want to do is really to scale. And I think we already did this before at some point. Let's try 1.1. Okay, like this. But now, of course, let's make it smooth. And so remember that all we have to do in order to do that is to add the transition property on the original element. So transition all, so which I'm always using, because then if later I add some other things here to the hover effect, then I can be sure that it is covered here in the transition property already. And let's again use our longer animation time, so the same time that we used also in the cards. And this could actually be another design decision that we could put here in general, so animation times. But well, let's not overcomplicate things. And so now the animation is nice and smooth, but still there is something missing because, well, it works perfectly, but it doesn't look really, really nice like this. So I think it does look a bit weird and a bit off. And so now that's where this container element comes into place. So the element into which we wrapped each of the images. So remember that down here, each of the images is inside of a figure, right? And so now as we scale up the images, they will basically overflow their parent element, right? And we can see that here in the inspector. So if we keep this one selected, well, cannot really see that, but if we turn on the grid, then it should become visible. And yeah, so basically each of these squares here is one of the figure elements. And so now as we hover, the image actually overflows that figure, right? And so what we can do to prevent that, remember, is to simply set overflow to hidden. And so that is the missing part of this trick and of this cool effect. So gallery item, overflow, hidden. And let's remove this, or actually don't yet. And so you see that now it does no longer overflow the figure because we fixed that with, once again, overflow hidden, which is a really important property that we need all the time. All right. And so now the images look as though they were the exact same size as before, but they scale in a little bit. So they kind of look as though they move towards the user as we hover them. And so this is something that I really like. And it is just another cool trick that we can do using the power of CSS. Nice. So very, very beautiful section here, I think. And I'm pretty sure that you also really like it. So that's just putting all the design guidelines that we used before into practice together with the power of CSS to achieve it.